Sewing is a hobby surrounded by tons of different myths, so in today's video let's talk about 7 biggest sewing myths and let's see if they are true or not. Let's start with biggest sewing myth number 1. You have to change needle for every project. Probably you have heard about this recommendation that you should change sewing machine needle for every project. And I personally have heard this before, and there was a time when I did believe this, but I never actually changed needles for every project because I do think it's a little bit excessive. So I decided to dig into this topic, and upon a little bit of research, I did find out the general recommendation is to change sewing machine needle every 8 hours of stitching. This is the recommendation that is used in the sewing industry, where the needle is changed every 8 hours of sewing. And by 8 hours of sewing, I mean 8 hours of sewing on the sewing machine and not calculating the time for pressing, cutting the pattern, and so on and so on. It might be difficult to keep account of how many hours you've been sewing with a specific needle, so one recommendation that I heard and absolutely loved was just adding a reminder in your calendar every month to switch to a new needle, and I think that's plenty of time to use the needle, and just changing the needle every month will guarantee you that you always work with a sharp, proper needle. Also a reminder that you should use this rule when it comes to sergers as well, because sergers also need to have their needles changed every 8 hours of sewing. So the myth that you need to change needles for every new project is debunked. Change needle every 8 hours of stitching, or change it once a month, and you will always have a sharp right needle on your sewing machine. Biggest sewing myth number 2 is that you can always tell when the garment is homemade. And that is absolutely not true. So I've been sewing for 15 years, nearly 16 years for myself, and I do have professional training. I am a certified seamstress, and part of my training did consist of spotting badly made garments, fitting mistakes, incorrect seams, and so on and so forth. And I can tell you honestly, having this background, in reality, in the wildlife, I've been able to spot a homemade item in life only a few times, and it wasn't because the garment was bad quality. Quite the contrary, I was able to spot the garment that was homemade simply because the garment was very unique. In a sea of ready-made garments, in a sea of fast fashion, where the fabrics, the sewing, the techniques, the designs, everything kind of looks the same, the garment that was made one piece, one design at the time, maybe specifically for that person, maybe specifically for a special occasion, is very unique and it stands out from the crowd. I would say that the only indication that is a giveaway that the garment is made at home and not by a professional is if the garment is not pressed properly. And it's especially visible on heavy items like coats or jackets. If it's not given a final press, it is a massive giveaway that the garment is made at home and it just looks not as good as it could. This is why when I do my tutorials, I always try to emphasize you make a seam, press it, you make a garment, give it a final press, because it gives a massive difference in the general garment look. And take one garment that is not pressed, press it properly, and it changes drastically and it looks way more professionally made. I know that pressing a garment is not the most exciting thing and it's not nearly as fun as sewing the garment, but when you finish making a garment, set a time to give it a proper press and it will transform the quality of the garment to the next level. So the myth that you can always spot a homemade item is just not true. Trust me, no one will notice that the side seam is not completely straight. No one will notice that the hem may be a little bit wavy. No one will notice those things. Biggest sewing myth number 3 is sewing is expensive. And this myth is partially true, because you can make sewing as expensive as you want or as cheap as you want. Compared to other hobbies that can produce clothes like crocheting or knitting, sewing does have a higher initial starting cost. If you want to start crocheting, essentially you need a hook and a pair of scissors. If you want to start knitting, essentially all you need is a pair of knitting needles and again scissors. If you want to start sewing, you need at least 7 things, which is a sewing machine, fabric scissors, hand sewing needle, pins, chalk, measuring tape. So initial starting cost for sewing, if you have to buy those items new, will be larger than starting crocheting or knitting. However, later on with fabrics, you have a lot of flexibility to make it either very expensive or very cheap. There was a point in my life when I wanted to sew, but my budget was very minimal. So what I would do, I would go to thrift stores, I would buy some used clothes and I would transform it using my sewing machine, or someone would give their old clothes to me and I would have fun transforming those clothes into something new, essentially for a zero budget. My current budget for sewing is from 8 to 12 euros per meter of fabric. I usually buy my fabrics in a medium price fabric store. I like their quality, I like their selection, and the price range is really good because it does fit in my budget. But if you want to work with higher quality fabrics, that budget definitely can be much higher. So one thing that I do love about sewing, you can make it as cheap as you want or as expensive as you want, and you can enjoy it no matter what your budget is. I think that it would be fun to count how much it actually costs to sew, so let me know if you would like to see a video on this. Biggest sewing myth number 4 is sewing is only for women. And this myth is completely untrue because it's a hobby that can be enjoyed by everyone. Look at how many fashion designers are men. Look at how many tailors are men. Look at how many sewing educators are men. And it's a very good indication that sewing can be enjoyed by everyone. As a person who creates content about sewing and mainly educational sewing content, I do have a little bit of data and a little bit of insights of how my audience looks. Now, my audience varies a little bit depending on the platform. On YouTube, about 20% of the viewers are men, and on Instagram and TikTok, about 10% of the viewers are men. Again, my content is strictly about sewing. It's mostly sewing tips and tutorials, and if a person doesn't like to sew, this content would not be very interesting to watch. So I do assume that if people are watching my content, they do love to sew. So again, from the audience, from 10 to 20% are men who love to sew. Biggest sewing myth number 5 is sewing is for old people. Now, this myth is absolutely not true, and one good thing about social media is we can see that people from all age groups are enjoying this hobby. Again, as a sewing content creator, I can see at the data and I see that people in all different age groups are watching my videos about sewing and my sewing tutorials. And the distribution among age groups are very similar, and viewers from 18 to 65+ years are enjoying sewing content. One of my favorite current sewing accounts is Max to Couture, who is a 7-year-old boy who loves to sew, and he just shows how much he enjoys creating beautiful garments. And I think it's a very good indication that sewing can be enjoyed no matter the age. I personally have been interested in sewing since I was a little girl. I was making my dolls their own clothes, and I started to take it more seriously when I turned 18 and I got my first sewing machine. So I definitely was sewing from very young age. Biggest sewing myth number 6, you need serger to sew. And that is not true. In fact, for the first 7 years of sewing, I didn't have a serger, and it was only when I enrolled to sewing school where I saw how much of a game changer a serger is. I sew a lot of knit fabrics, so for me, having a serger is essential. However, if you work with woven fabrics, if you love finishes like French seam or bias tape seam finish, having a serger is definitely not necessary, and you can achieve beautiful seam finishes without having a serger. 7th and final biggest sewing myth is that it takes years to learn to sew. And this is both true and false. And I also think that the situation has changed significantly in the past 10-15 years. So back when I started sewing 15 years ago, there wasn't that much information freely available. The tutorials were very limited, and they usually were not covering the entire garment, but mostly like a teeny part of the garment making process. So if you were starting back in those days, and if you didn't have anyone to help you sew close by, and you had to navigate it yourself, it did take a lot of time to gather all the necessary information and to join it into one finished garment piece. And back in those days, yes, learning on your own how to sew did take quite a lot of time. However, nowadays we have tons and tons of different information, and there are so many beautiful patterns that are followed by very detailed long tutorials, video tutorials, written tutorials, written pattern photo instructions, and definitely a lot of tools to help you sew quite well, even if it's your first garment. So I would say that you can start sewing and create your first wearable garment quite fast. It definitely doesn't take years, more so like a week or a month. However, if you truly want to master sewing, it will take years and years and years, and even to this day, I've been sewing for 15 years, I still find tons of new things to learn about sewing. So with the help of tutorials, nowadays you don't have to spend years learning how to sew on your own, and you can create wearable garments quite fast. So these are all the myths I wanted to share with you today. If you have more sewing myths that you would like to see debunked, please leave them in the comment section. And if you enjoyed this video, you might be interested in watching this video next. Thank you for watching today, and I will see you next time. Bye!